So why this topic, right? And I feel like that's the first thing that always goes through my mind, and especially when I'm looking at what we want to teach in the upcoming months or weeks or whatever. And this one to me it's so important. And part of it is that we use data for so many things and to answer questions and to give us confidence in our decisions. And for me, like I'm such a data person when it comes down to making any choice. And for me, the data is it's like this neutral friend that is giving me advice on which direction to go as I'm navigating life or picking whatever that next thing is. I find that my friends that are not data tend to have like their own spin on it. And what I want is just like that unadulterated data where I can see, and obviously data still has bias, and that's a problem too, but it gives me closer to that. And that's really what these sessions are all about, is helping with understanding how to be more effective working with data, right? To give those basics of data literacy to you so that you can function well with it too. Now, when we have questions, there is zero shortage of data to find answers in these days, whether it's professional, personal, whatever, right? And one of the slides in here I'll show you guys today, it's about weather. And I went and pulled, it was immediately available. I was able to go just pull this weather data down, which in my mind, I was like, that's so wild that I can just get access to this. But a lot of times that data is not structured in a way that's really easy to use, or it makes a ton of sense. And you'll see that when you go to use either trying to do some sort of presentation on your own, or you pull it into a Tableau, and it's just fighting you. And you're like, man, why is this so hard? And a lot of times it comes down to the way it's structured. So we're going to cover 3 kind of high-level topics today. The first one is what to look for in data. Now, keep in mind, and I know this as I'm saying this, but sometimes you don't have a choice, right? Sometimes it comes through as it is. But if you have a choice, we're going to talk about some of the things that make it, more effective in being able to give you the outcomes you want. And that's really the big thing, right? It's always focused on outcomes for me. That's where my mind always goes to. The second thing is, what does well-structured data look like, right? And I'll go into that as well, into what I mean by that. And then the third thing is how to restructure your data to make it meet your needs. So what do you do if your data isn't well structured? And let me start with a caveat here too, that this is not an ETL session where I'm going to go in and talk about how to extract, transform, and load all of your data and all the different intricate ways that you can do that. It's definitely not this one, right? This session is a little bit more introductory, and we're working on kind of the fundamentals of what structure looks like and how to work with that. We will go in and show some techniques to work through it, but if you're hoping for all of that, just give you a heads up, I'm not going to go into all of that. All right, so let's dig into the first section here. So what to look for in your data. And I'll talk about this again later on, but, when we talk about what good data is, I understand that that's relative, but what to look for in data for it to work for you. So you'll also know, if you've been on any of my sessions before, that I love stories. I feel like it's one of the clearest ways that we relate to each other and basically kind of feel what the other person is talking about. So you'll see a lot of those today. So if you hate stories, I'm sorry, just is what it is. So recently my lights in my kitchen went out. So I have a kitchen that was like, gosh, I think my house was built in the 60s or the 70s. And it's like the long fluorescent tubes. Now, not so far back that it was like the 8-foot ones, but like, and if you guys don't remember those are crazy. 8-foot long light bulbs, wild. But mine were the 4-foot ones, right? And they're those fluorescent tubes, and they had the plastic like shroud over the tubes that kind of hung down. And over the years, man, I bumped those shrouds so many times, and they were broken, and the light was just kind of uncomfortable in there. They've been needing to be replaced for a while, and they finally died. And the ballast, which is the piece that actually holds it, gave out. So I had to replace them, right? And as I'm thinking about replacing them, I've got to pick out new lights, which if you ever had to do that, it's horrible. But I needed to in this case. But there's a lot of questions, right? What color do I want? What brightness do I need them to be? What do I want them to look like on the ceiling? And all these are outcomes that I need to consider as I'm making this choice for putting in these brand new lights. Right. And it's really similar when we're working with data, is that we need to be thinking about, okay, what is the outcome that I'm looking for, and what traits does the data need to make those outcomes possible? And that's really the first thing, right? So when we think about this, where are you going with it? And if you aren't quite sure about that, I always say that it's good to start broad at that point, but keep in mind that the more data you have, you're also putting a lot more load on your systems and your network. So it's not necessarily as fast to explore. So there's lots that you can look for. Today, we're going to cover 5 traits. So, and you'll see them on here: high volume, historical, detailed, standardized, and consistent. And standardized and consistent kind of go together. So I know I'm saying 5, but it's really more like 4. And if you want to learn more about this too, so I'm going to cover these, but I would say I actually highly recommend. We have a trail on this in Trailhead, which is Salesforce's free self-guided training platform. And it's under the Build Your Data Literacy trail, and it's called Well-Structured Data. It's a module within that. And that was built by Sue Kramer. So if you want to go in and check that out, great content in there. So let's get into those 4 traits. The first one is high volume. So again, if you've been on any of my sessions before, you know that I can't eat dairy or gluten. So for me, restaurant recommendations are like really, really critical because I hate to go in and not know that ahead of time. So I'm always asking friends like, oh, is this one good? Do they have gluten-free options? And I wish that I wasn't having to deal with that, but here I am. So the thing with that though is that if one person tells me that that restaurant is fine, like, based on the person, I might believe them. But if 100 people tell me the same thing and all of them tell me that that restaurant's good, it's really tough for me to dismiss it at that point, right? Because the number of the number of those reviews or the number of that feedback, it's convincing. It gives me a lot more confidence in what I'm hearing, right? That it's actually going to be right. Same thing with reviews when we're buying stuff online. But more relevant data gives us a lot more confidence in our results. Now, I'm going to show an example here real quick. And this is a dashboard that I built in Tableau Public using the Data Plus TV data set. If you haven't tried that out, give that a check out too. That's the Data Plus TV challenge. In this case, though, we're looking at this, and it's I built this because it's always hard to find a TV show to watch with the way that things are on all the streaming services. So in this one, though, I'm going to choose a genre, and I'm going to clear out. I was looking at sport originally, but I'm going to say let's do all and then nothing to clear it out. And I want to see adventure, and I'm going to apply that. And that's going to narrow down my fields to just a few on this side, specifically 635 of them that are also rated above 8.5 stars or points. I don't know what that is. But if I'm looking at this, I'm like, okay, I've heard of Game of Thrones. And in this case, 2.2 million people voted on this, 2.2 plus million people voted on it. And it still came in at a 9.2, right? That inspires a lot of confidence. Now, compared to that, this next one was also a 9.2, Jet Lag, the game, right? And I have not watched this, so I have no idea how good this is. But this one only has 251 votes, right? So if I'm looking at those two and I'm trying to decide which one to watch, I have a lot more confidence that Game of Thrones with 2.2 million votes is truly going to be 9.2, more so than watching Jet Lag, the game. I'm not saying that Jet Lag, the game is bad. I'm just saying that we have more confidence, we have that volume to reinforce these things that we're seeing in our data. If we're looking back on our information. So when we look at that opportunity and we're saying, okay, what am I looking for? High volume, that's what we mean by that, is that it gives us a little more depth to go in and have that confidence. Now, keep in mind too, that the increase in volume is also going to be a difference in performance, right? So if you're worried about performance, then maybe not quite that much, but it's great to have enough that's going to be relevant for what you're working with, or relevant enough that's going to be giving you the results you're looking for. So the second one, and arguably one of my favorites, is historical data. So we want data that has history. Now, when I started at Tableau back in 2014, we used to have people coming in from all over the country to go through boot camp and just, to visit the office, because we had offices all over the place. And I had, constantly had all these people from out of town come in, and they'd be like, man, it's always sunny here. They're like, this place is great. I don't know what you guys are talking about. And they'd always come in the summer, and I would laugh, and I was just like, man, it's so funny, because I've been coming here to visit my wife, and we have friends here for years. I mean, a lot of my life, and I really know what it is like, right? And I have that historical point of reference. So it's the same thing for them. Like, it's naive to say after one time without that history that it's always sunny in Seattle. I wish that were the case, because when it is sunny here, it's gorgeous. There's no better place on earth than when it's sunny here. But if we look back, and that's what I did, this is what I was talking about earlier on when I talked about pulling that data. I pulled the last 3 years of weather data, and you can see here that we have this, we have obviously temperature is the blue line, and then precipitation is the orange. And toward the summer, when the temperature goes up, our precipitation goes down, and we have this window, right? And this is like the golden window. And this is what I honestly attracts a lot of people to Seattle is they're here during this time and they're like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. And then the 9 months of dark settle in, right? And or 8 months or whatever. And that's where we have lower temperatures, higher precipitation, and it just stays great for a while. But without the historical look back or without being here more than just that one day, we wouldn't have enough information to be able to make an accurate forecast or to anticipate what's going to happen, right? So when we're looking at data, it's really important that we do, especially if we're making decisions going forward based on this, that we have information that's historical that really reinforces that. And I talk about this in one of my other ones too, but trust is so paramount when we're working with data. And having information that goes back like that helps build trust for people when they're looking at the data. They're like, all right, they have that information. I can trust what they're showing me going forward. I have that. All right. So historical. So the first one was high volume. Second one was historical. The third one that we're going to go into now, go back to my slide here, is detail. So we want detailed information. And I'm going to go in again, and I have another example. I'm going to show you guys here in one sec. We'll get to that one here in a sec. So I keep talking about house stuff, but we are in the middle of adding on to our house. We bought a house in Seattle a while ago, and it was bitty, 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 very small. And I have 2 kids, and I have a couple dogs, and all the things that come along with growing kids. And the house had just gotten tight, so we're adding on. Now, as we've added on, it's an old house, so there's just constantly stuff that goes wrong as we're building. Right? We're finding it, we're like, oh my gosh, okay, what are we gonna do with this now? The one that came on this time was that we were working on some plumbing. We had to add plumbing into the addition. And when we hooked everything back up and we turned the water back on, if you don't turn it on slow, it slams all the water forward. And a lot of the sediment that settles in pipes from old pipes shoots forward into all the places where it could exit, right? And in this case, that's going to be my faucet. And we were having a problem in the kitchen where our water pressure just dropped off. And me, I have a history of working in areas where I do troubleshooting, right? So for the troubleshooting, my mind was like, okay, first let me check the water supply. Water supply is good. Then let me check the valves under the sink. Valves are good, right? Then the line going up to the faucet. Line going to the faucet's good. And then finally, at the end, the faucet, right? And I go to the faucet and I check, and there's like a little screen thing at the end of the faucet. You pull it off, and there's some sediment in there, right, that was blocking the way. And really, the whole point of the story is that at each dead end, I needed to get more detailed, right? And I'm getting more and more granular as I dig into the data to figure out what's causing my problem here. And it's the same thing with our data here, right? When we're looking at trying to figure out why something's happening, or we're looking at like, okay, what's the root of this problem? If you're not familiar with the 5 whys, I would suggest checking that out, where it's that was invented, I guess is the right word, or yeah, I guess invented by Toyota. And it's basically saying, why did that happen? Why did that happen? Why did this happen? And it's digging in, it's that root cause analysis. But without detail, we can't really do that, right? And I know a lot of times too, what ends up happening with data, and this is an interesting one, is that a lot of times data is basically pre-aggregated for you or built in a specific way for you. Let's go back in orders and then oh, well, look at that. I'm missing all my information. So I'm going to reconnect to that real quick here. So a lot of times what I was talking about is that the data will be pre-aggregated because people are trying to find ways to make it more efficient, or they only want it to be stuff that's in a specific domain. But by doing that, a lot of times when we pre-aggregate, we lose the ability to go in and see that specific detail or see that root cause of what's going on. So let me pull out my orders here real quick. There we go. It's going to take a second to cache. So let me go into my sheet. But imagine that if we were in here and we saw, okay, I'm looking at my, maybe my profit per category or something like that. I said, okay, well, let's look at my profit, and I want to look at it by category. And I can see my number there, and I'm like, okay, well, I want to dig deeper. Well, I can go, in this case, because I have the data, I can say, okay, what about by subcategory? What about by specific product? And this allows me to really drill down to that lower level. But if I went in, and instead of having the ability to go in that far, and maybe my data was pre-aggregated, so let's do a quick pretend example here. Oh, and you can't see my calculation screen. It's not over here. There we go. And we're just going to say, okay, let's do fixed. Let's do it at category level. And of course, we'll do that just for fun. And we'll replace that. Now, imagine that my data was pre-aggregated to the category level, and I said, okay, I want to know my sales by or profit by subcategory. I can't go any deeper, right? And it's limited there. And I know I just created this example on the fly, but this is a typical thing that happens where people are like, oh, from a data perspective, let's give them this chunk of data and let's aggregate it up to that level. It'll be more performance friendly. It'll give them the information they want, but it doesn't allow you to go in and figure out, okay, what's going on here? So that's really important. Now, again, that's something you have to work out with your data team. But it also is important to have information from other domains to know where those points of influence or those correlations come from. All right. Let's go back to our slide here. And the last one on this that I want to talk about is standardization and consistency. So, you know, again, on the same house situation, my brother-in-law and I end up using a dump trailer to dump a lot of our waste as we're going through this process. And there's plenty of times where he and I are trying to back the trailer up. And if you've ever backed a trailer, you know that the moment a trailer starts going backwards and the lights come on or starts beeping or whatever, it's like a magnet for people. Someone always comes over and like wants to give you hand signs and stuff, right? And everybody's trying to be helpful. Totally get that. But what ends up happening is that the person in the back generally is not speaking the same hand sign language as the person in the front. And we end up like doing these weird hand signs at each other and not getting where we want to go, right? And that's similar here because a lot of times there's a difference or lack of consistency in the way that people are naming fields or date formats or number formats or whatever that is, and it prevents us from getting the accurate results that we want. So standardization and consistency are so critical. This is probably honestly one of the biggest ones here. The other stuff is really important, you know, for what you're trying to do, so it kind of affects your outcome. But if you don't have standardization and consistency, then anything programmatic, whether it's Tableau or any other tool, is going to struggle. It is, right? Unless you were just a whiz with regex or regex, I'm not sure how you say that. But unless you're a whiz with that, it's going to be really tough to clean something like that up. All right, so let me show a quick example here. So I used to work at a cell phone retail store, and we tracked all sorts of stuff. But a lot of it was tracked manually, and a lot of it came through a point of sale system. So it'd be people entering things manually as they're doing returns or inventory or whatever that is. And when they processed it, we would end up with all these different versions of the same thing, right? If you look at this image, and then my mouse is not easy to see, I know, but we'd have like, you know, iPhone 5, all one word, or then we'd have iPhone space 5, you know, or I space phone space 5 down here. And that lack of consistency would make it so that when we pulled it into any kind of tool to analyze our data, every single one of those was its own value, right? So I couldn't get this really clean combined view of what was going on with it. And rightfully so, right? From a program standpoint, it doesn't know. There's no way for it to know what you're talking about when those things are all named differently. So when we think about if we have any impact on what that looks like, standardizing, okay, what's our naming convention for these things? And it's literally like mapping it out. Like, what's the first part? What's the second part? Third part? Do we use hyphens? Do we use underscores? I mean, even think about this internally at your company when you guys are sharing files or you're saving your own files, right? How many times is it like, you know, Sam2 good or Sam2 space good underscore exclamation point, right? What, like we name things crazy names, and without that standardization or a naming convention, it just makes it all but impossible for us to get really good analytics going forward. So that's really, really important. And consistency just being that we have the same understanding, right? When I say this word, do we mean the same thing? And that's, gosh, this is why data literacy becomes so important, is that we have to be able to have a common ground where we come together to talk about this kind of stuff. And that doesn't happen unless we all have these basic bits of knowledge. All right, let me go back to our slides real quick. Now, some of the things that I talked about too, like currency or date format, stuff like that, that can be done later on, like in a Tableau or something like that. But the ones that are harder are the ones where it's broken and funny, like the string is not correct, or like the naming is weird. That I can't, you can do some of it, but some of it just needs to be done ahead of time. And a lot of that's just planning, right? And working with your data team. All right, we're moving forward into the next section, and we're talking about what well-structured data looks like. And I know this is kind of a loaded statement because what is, I mean, it's relative or relevant. Yeah, relative. What is well-structured, right? And there's plenty of ways that we can talk about that. And I'm going to talk about kind of a specific view here, but let me show you again in Tableau, a quick example. So let's go back to our data source page. And I'm going to switch to a different data source here. All right, and this first one we're looking at, it's a very small, again, I'm using examples, right? If I were to use an actual data set that was something you would use, it'd just be enormous, and we couldn't actually do it on this call without it crashing things. So just because I'm streaming so much right now. But when we're looking at this data, basically you can see a couple things, right? So we have a column over here on the left, and then that is our product types, and then we have an individual column for each quarter. So this isn't what I would call, it's not like, I feel like we need to get rid of the words good or bad, right? So I know I called it well-structured, but there will be some things about this that will work and won't work well for what you're trying to do. And this is what I would consider like a human readable version, right? The way that it's structured is not made for machine consumption. And what I mean by that is when I go into Tableau, and if let me clear that out, and I want to look at my product types, and I want to look at my sales for all these different product types. Actually, you know what? Let's look at this as text so you guys can see the numbers. Try that again. Oh, that's right. I was doing text. Just kidding, guys. Here we go. I got ahead of myself. So we can bring them all out, and I can look at this. But this relies so heavily on human skills, right? For me to be able to make totals of these things. And part of that, if you look, is that I can't get row totals because Tableau is saying these are all individual fields. Unless you write a calculation, I can't add those up for you because it's not one field. I can't do that aggregation. I can give you column grand totals because that's a single field. And keep in mind too, like, right, a lot of times I know when I used to teach this stuff, people are like, oh, there's a way you can get around that. You can make a calculation. And there's always a way, right, where you can go in and manipulate and hack and do all those things. But for me, it's always, what can I do to make this the cleanest at its base level so that I don't need to do a lot of that manipulation downstream, right? My time is too valuable for that now. I don't know about yours, but I don't have a lot of that extra time for that. So I don't want to do that. So when we look at this data, it's just not in a form that's going to be really efficient for what I'm looking for. But again, what that comes back to is, what are you trying to use it for? So if I go back to my slides here, I think I say that on there, know the intended use case. What are you going to do with it? Is it just a quick spreadsheet that you're showing somebody internally? Is it going to be used by visualization software? Are you preparing the data to give it to someone else? That's not uncommon, right? Where you're handing it off. And each of those methods will change how you structure your data, right? If you're just doing a quick spreadsheet to show someone something, like, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to go in with a few rows of data and like manipulate it and do all this stuff to bring it into Tableau, because when I'm just showing somebody a little bit of information. But if it's programmatic or it's something that's going to be used every so often, then yeah, absolutely. All right, so the first thing to keep in mind here is that we're working with columns and rows. So columns are things going up and down on your page, so top to bottom, and then rows are going to be left to right, right? So stretching across the page. So columns, like a column in a building, right? I always think of like the old Greek buildings where they have the columns in the front. And I couldn't think of a good one for rows, but they just go left to right, right? And in this one, in this example, the quarters, so quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, and quarter 4 are columns. And our rows just being the different product types. Now, if you're using something like Tableau, what we're hoping for is not that, but we're hoping for something like this. Not this one, because I just pulled that in off the other one. Sorry, it's still hanging up on that. But what we're hoping for, and ignore these. Actually, I think I can delete these so we don't have to see them. Let's delete those. Make it a little clearer. Is we're hoping for, in this case, a row being an instance or an event, and think about like something that exists in your data, right? A thing that happened. Like if I commuted to work this morning, and each of the columns are going to be details about that instance. In this case, what quarter was it? What are the values for it? And the instance was appliances, right? So in this case, all the information about appliances for these different quarters, or binders and binders, accessories, or bookcases, or whatever. And that's what we're looking for, right? We want a row being an instance and a column being the details about that instance. All right, and if I look at it in an actual data source, here, let's go into a quick data here real quick. This is ideal, right? We want this long data where we have a row for each instance and then a column for each of those details within it. Okay, so those are the things that we're looking for. Now, again, keep in mind that there's a bunch of different data sources out there, and there's different ways to structure things, right? If you're creating a CSV, then you're not going in and manually doing that in the actual CSV of the text file. So there's going to be exceptions to each one of these rules. But these are things that we want if we're working with a tool like a Tableau to make sure that it's consumed really well. All right. So what if it's not well structured, right? What if it is not in great shape? So there are a few things that we can do, and I know this first one, you may, if you're sighing at me and you're like, oh my gosh, Sam, of course. I'm sorry, but I think this one is arguably the most important when it comes down to data and data structure, which is to go back to the source. Odds are you have people that are your data team or that are working with the data that are creating these things and distributing them. If it's in your personal life, I get it, you don't have somebody else to go to, but going back to the source and working with them. Now, the reason I say that is that you can go in and restructure, and we're going to talk about how to do some of that here. But it doesn't fix what made it that way in the first place when we just do this at the end, right? It's like I can Band-Aid a cut. But if I keep going back and slicing my hand in the same place, I'm going to keep Band-Aiding it over and over and over again. And it's not fixing the issue, which is the sheet metal that's hanging out, right? That I keep hitting my arm on. So what we need to do in that case, I'd be to go back and fix the sheet metal, right? Or in this case, go back to your data person and figure out what's the issue that's going on here. What's the bigger issue? So the other reason for that is that, and from your data person's perspective, this is probably what they're thinking, which is that you doing this and making changes potentially creates an additional data source or a new data source that may or may not follow corporate standards. And we talked about consistency and standardization, and this is one of those things where ad hoc, this is a great way to fix it. But if you have somebody that's doing that for you, it's really important that you're sticking with that consistency and that standardization. Because if we do it this way for us, this might be the way that works best for me, but it might totally wreck it for somebody else, right? So we want to be considerate of that. And that's why I always say, go to your data team first and talk with them about what we want to do and what the outcome is that you're trying to achieve. Outcomes are like the biggest part of this. I mean, it's so easy to go to them and say, I just need this pivoted. But like, why? Like, what are you trying to do? And that will help them be the best that they can be to get you that data that you're looking for as well. I used to work with a person that would ask me those questions without context constantly, and it used to drive me absolutely bananas because I would do things that weren't great because I didn't have that context, right? So we really need that. Now, there's a couple things that we're going to talk through, and the first one on here is split them up. And this is pretty common. And if you haven't worked with a lot of data, or even if you have, I'm sure you've come up against this, which is, let me go to my data here, that when we work with string data, and gosh, I feel like I need to do a session just on terms, but string data is all the text, right? It's the words. And when we get string data where everything is kind of been mashed together, and this happens, right? Where it's like you get a lot of words or values or numbers, and we need to basically go in and say, okay, those all should be their own individual field, and I want to break them apart. There's ways that you can do this outside of Tableau. I'm going to show it in Tableau because I think this is super cool. This is one of my favorite things that is just out of the box functionality in here. Now I'm going to look at this field, which is customer ID, right? So we're looking at this field, and what we have is the initials of the person in the front. So Annie Thurman, AT, and then we have their number, 7352. I have no idea what that number means. I'm just using this example data for it. But this is the string is basically pulled together, and it's joined, not joined, I hate that's not the right word, it's combined using what's called a delimiter, right? Or a separator is what Tableau calls it, but it's a delimiter, right? And it's the same thing when you think about a CSV, that's a comma separated value. The comma is the delimiter in that case. So when we're working with this string, it's saying, okay, there's something that connects these two values. And what I'm doing when I go in to do a split is I'm picking that thing, or I'm telling it that thing that we're going to use to break this field apart. So if I want to take this field and say, okay, I want it in two pieces instead, I'm going to right click. And then down here, I have either the option to split, which is going to be automated. It's just going to do its own thing, or a custom split where I get to make the decision. And again, like this one I'm showing right now, customer ID, it probably actually needs those two things together. But in some of the other data that I work with, where it's like there's two pieces that shouldn't be together, or maybe I want to separate first name from last name or whatever, right? That's what this is all about. So how should this data be split? Use the separator. And in this case, we're going to use a dash or a hyphen, whatever you want to call it. And then it's going to say split off what? Basically, how much of this do I want to break apart? And I'm going to say, in this case, all, but you could choose specific columns if you wanted. And then I'll just say, OK. Then Tableau is going to go in and create these two new columns at the end of my data. And you can see that it's saying this is a calculation because it's made this for us, where I have my initials, and then I have that number in the back. Now, again, I know there's so many caveats, right? Working with data is such a nuanced thing. Where people are going to be like, oh, well, mine are inconsistent and they don't line up that way, or that only works when it's like this. And yeah, you're absolutely right, right? There are going to be ones where what I just did is not enough. And that's where I mentioned it earlier with things like regex or calculations come in to start splitting some of those more complicated things off. But this is just a basic function when we're working in structuring our data or changing things that you can do that'll solve a lot of what you're working with. It may not be everything, but it will help. All right, the next one we're talking about, let me go back to my slideshow here. I know you guys just dive more slides, is pivot, pivot, pivot. And when I'm talking about pivots, we're talking about structure. I'm not talking about how to make a pivot table. So please keep that in mind. That is a different thing. Same concept, but just I'm not going to do that in Excel. All right, so when we're working with data, and I'm going to go into an example here. Again, I've talked about this human consumable data. And human consumable data is typically wider, right? It's typically wider, and where what tends to happen is people will use things like dates or like time fields, and they'll spread them across the sheet. And that, again, when we're presenting it to someone to visually consume it, that makes sense. I get it. But you'll hit a point where it's too wide to consume, or we'll hit a point where we want to use this in a machine consumable way. And what we need to do at that point is we need to take these fields, especially in this case where we have like a date field or a quarter or whatever, and we literally want to rotate it down so that it's vertical instead of horizontal. And if you look at this too, you'll notice that we have appliances, and we have a value for appliances for Q1, a value for appliances for Q2, a value for appliances for Q3 and Q4. So as we pivot this down, what we're going to need is a new row for each of those individual quarters. And I've got a small version we're going to do here on the call just to illustrate this point. So I'm literally going to take my data, and I'm just going to pull this out of the way real quick, just so we have some space. And we're going to select these, copy, and we're going to paste it and transpose it. So we have those down there. And the reason I did that is that I want to get rid of these going horizontally, and I'm changing this field to be a quarter, right? I want to name it something that's more of a category instead of something that's that individual granular field. But I don't have a Q1 just for each one, or Q1 or Q2 for each of these things. So I'm going to move these down. We're going to copy that, and we're going to say, okay, I need an appliances for each one of those. And then the same thing for these other ones, right? So if I say, okay, I want chairs and chair mats, I want envelopes, and then I want tables. And what we've done here is we've basically said, okay, we've made a new row for each one of those specific fields that we were working with. Now we just need to make sure that each one of these also has the quarters that were associated with it too. We're almost there, right? We've got some of these moved down. So now our quarters run down as a column instead of horizontally as a row. Now for our values still go left to right, right? So this is still Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4. So again, I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it. Doesn't matter where I paste it. And I'm going to transpose that. So now my values go vertical. So now that's going to be columnar values. So I'm just going to take these and shift them over to where they belong. And granted, would you ever do this with a gigantic data set? Absolutely not, right? But I'm showing you so we can illustrate the concept and you can understand what's happening when we do a pivot. So we've taken all those values and we've rotated them down. So we now have this longer data set, and I'm just going to call this sales. So wide versus long, and the length is what we're really looking for. Now, if I had shown the whole example, this is what it looks like in that form. And now when we pull it into Tableau, let's go back to that data set. And we're going to pull this one in. Oh, it is the right one. Sweet. So now we go into our sheet, and let me clear this out. Instead of having to do an individual quarter column for each one, I now have my quarters listed out this way, and I can bring in my values, or my sales in this case, and I can now see them this way, right? I don't have an individual column for each one of those things. And if I said, okay, let's bring in my product type too, let's do product type and then quarter. I just have a lot more flexibility, right? And I can let Tableau do the aggregation instead of me trying to do it manually. So when we're thinking about that pivot or that alteration of the data is really, really important when we're bringing that into a more columnar structure. So long is the win here. Now, wide, if we have a number of details that we want to keep, I'm not saying you shouldn't have columns that have individual details that flesh it out. But you do want to think about what's relevant there. And as you're bringing this in, you'll probably hit a point in your career where you're thinking about extracting your data or pulling it out of that live data source. And then you want to think about, what do I really need for this exploration? Like Sam said, I need enough detail. Yeah, I talked about myself in the third person, sorry. But you need enough detail to get your answers, but not so much that it's just going to be this enormous, unwieldy data set. So that's where in an extract, you can identify what you want that to be and pull it out. All right, so we have covered a few things here. And usually the next question I get is, what next? What do I do? First thing is be a sponge and practice, right? More practice, the better it's going to be. Now, I would highly encourage you to up your data literacy. We have free self-guided trainings on Trailhead, and that link, which is going to be in the deck, will take you there. Go check those out. They will take you through basic data literacy, through stuff on stats, then things in AI. There's a bunch. It's awesome. It's all self-guided and at your pace, so you can take that as fast or as slow as you want. I download Tableau Public. You need a tool that can allow you to just work with data and experiment, and it's free, and you can now save locally with it too. So there's no reason not to download that and use that to start to get your skills built up. Download free data sets, which are also on Tableau Public. Check out community programs. These are ways where you can go get like tangible examples and actual things you can try to really shore up your skills. This is an awesome place to go to start working on shaping your data or structuring it so that it's more effective. The last thing on here is explore the Data Fan Discovery Kit. This is where a lot of these things are highlighted, these webinars come up. So if you haven't checked that out yet, there's a lot of great stuff in there. And then the last thing I said, share with others. I always share this story too, where, you know, if you're keeping it to yourself, your skills don't grow, right? And when I've tried to learn Spanish in the past, it just goes away. And the reason is that I don't share it. I don't try to do it with other people. And then it falls apart because I'm not getting that reinforcement. So share this with others. One more thing on here too, January 15th, we would love to have you join us for this event when climate change meets Tableau. And it's from 9 to 10:30 Pacific time, and it's on the Tableau Newbies user group. So if you haven't joined that yet or signed up for that yet, please sign up for that. We would love to have you. Again, these community groups where we get a chance to come together and learn is like one of the best opportunities for us to really invest in ourselves and then to increase our knowledge or our scope of knowledge. Outside of that, thank you guys for being here. I think we will open it up for just a few minutes of Q&A.